I think at some point, each one of us, and just if we look around, someone has been a scapegoat. Whether you are a scapegoat in your family or whether in the larger community, but there's this like really interesting concept of like being a scapegoat and what that does to us as people, how that like essentially influences our purpose, how that influences how we see the world, how we interact with other communities. And what's so fascinating to me is that every person in some form or shape has been a scapegoat. Yet sometimes people just don't realize that. What if the key to transformation lies in shifting your perspective? Hi, I'm Dr. Payal Beri. Welcome to Reframing Perspectives. Every conversation here is about one thing: how empathy changes the way we lead, connect, and create impact. Each episode, we get to explore deep, authentic conversations designed to expand your mindset. Whether you're looking to transform your leadership, deepen your relationships within your circle, your community, and friends, or gain clarity in your own personal growth, each episode will inspire you to see things differently and take action. If you're ready to challenge your thinking and embrace transformation, you're in the right place. Let's dive in. So it was really great today because I got to talk to Amina and Samantha. Amina is a holistic business and career coach, proud immigrant, and she often works with marginalized communities to help them realize possibilities in a way that honors their particular lived experiences, and the author of The Ambition Trap, as well as Samantha, who is a cultural anthropologist and an expert in cross-cultural management, where she really leans into holding space for what makes our lives different and how we are understanding the decline in our cultural diversity globally and what is the course correcting power of this. So what was really awesome today was that I got to dive in with Amina and Samantha about what it means to live in this existence where, of course, in the moment, we feel deeply about the community or the demographic that tends to get scapegoated. But this is a problem that has existed from the beginning of mankind. And so how is it that we can lean into having more empathy? And why is it that we can have empathy for our own group and our own community, but if another community is going through the exact same thing, why is it so hard for us to hold empathy for them? And so this idea of scapegoating, so that we take off the pressure of the problems or accountability that happens within us and how we put that onto another group and another community without having to address our own issues. Oh my gosh, this conversation could have gone on honestly forever. It's a beautiful one. And I couldn't imagine having this conversation with anyone else besides Samantha and Amina. I'm just so excited, Amina and Samantha, to talk to the both of you about this because, I mean, you guys are both, first of all, just pure magic. Second is that Samantha, like as a cultural anthropologist, like your eye on understanding this on just like such a bigger scale is so fascinating, so interesting. And Amina, like you really bring forward just like your own expertise and understanding of like generational cycle breaking and purpose and how that leans into the work that people who feel deeply about needing to have meaning and what does success mean through that. It all is intertwined with the work that you're doing with women and, you know, looking at the grander scheme. So I'm just so excited to talk to both of you.
Yeah, so excited to be here.
Yeah, what a joy. What a joy.
So let's just like dive right in. Like when you think about scapegoats, like when you think about like that word alone, right? And what that has looked like in the work that you're doing, you know, Amina, for you, like with your clients, with like these leaders and entrepreneurs and founders who are doing phenomenal work out there, you know, who are shifting the paradigm of the world and the way that we interact in it. How does that show up with you?
I think the first thought that I have around scapegoats, and this is such an interesting conversation, and I can't wait to hear what Samantha has to say, but I think of glass cliff moments, and I've had my own glass cliff moments. All of my clients have had glass cliff moments. So those of us that make it through the glass ceiling often have a glass cliff moment, and we're often asked to turn something around, like a company. We're given half the time, half the resources, no mentorship, and then we get edged off the proverbial cliff. And I absolutely had my own experience with that, where the last role I had in marketing was as head of brand integration for this global beauty and spa brand. And I didn't ask enough questions. There was definitely some stuff on my side of the street going in there. I didn't ask enough questions, but there was some stuff that I couldn't know until I got on the job. And it turns out that the brand was really sort of pacing behind Target by several millions of dollars. And they wanted me to close that gap in the last quarter. And I was like, cool, like, what's the budget? And they were like, well, there really isn't a budget. There's like $30,000 left in the budget. And I was like, cool, like, what's my team look like? And they're like, yeah, that's the other thing. Like, there's just not a lot of that either. And so they're like, what are you going to do? And I jokingly said, okay, I'm just going to use that $30,000 and buy $30,000 worth of lottery tickets, because I think that's really what we can do here. And I did my best to really try and turn things around, but like there just wasn't the resources. And I didn't have the language for it at that time, but it really was such a glass cliff moment. And then I started to see it in so many of my clients. We get blamed for it. And then basically the very sort of stereotypical leader has to come in, and then it's called the savior effect, basically like save us. But we wouldn't need to be saved if we were given appropriate resources, appropriate time, appropriate mentorship. And so we get scapegoated for a lot of the challenges inside of businesses and organizations.
Yeah, that's so interesting. Like, you don't even realize that, right? It's like you've become so good at what you do that you probably don't need half the things that you would have gotten if you were below the glass ceiling. It's like almost kind of like a idea that, oh, okay, well, we're still nurturing you, but then you get to a point you're like, all right, now go do it. But you're kind of set up to fail in that,
Yeah,
right? You're set up to
100%.
fail in that system. Samantha, what about you? Like, when you think about it from that cultural perspective, we think about like the timeline of just like generations of all of this in existence. Like, what do you think about when you think about scapegoating?
Yeah, the first thing that I think of, and it ties in actually a lot to, I don't know what you were saying, is for me, whenever I'm thinking of a word or a term, I always like to think about the origin or kind of where it originated from, because then it gives you a bit more of a holistic view on how it's being used, and maybe the things that we're forgetting about when we're talking about it. And it's interesting because I didn't intentionally go and look this up, but a few weeks ago in a book that I was reading, it actually went into like the history of scapegoating. And so I just so happened to know more about it for this conversation, which was really
Wow,
convenient. I'm
perfect.
going to try and remember all the details. So please, nobody quote me on all of this. Go look it up for yourself. Fact checking is always very important. But essentially, the term originated in kind of the religious times. So like more in like the biblical religious times. And a scapegoat was there was a specific ceremony that a community would do where essentially they would cast all of the sins of the community onto this one goat, and then they would send it free so that it would just like run into the wilderness. And the idea is that everybody would then be forgiven or absolved of their sin until another year came around. And so this goat was seen as like dirty. You couldn't go near it, right? Because it was just so disgusting. And then the concept was then that God or, the wild would take care of it and your sins with it. And so for me, when I think of that, my mind goes right away to the person doing the scapegoating as opposed to the victim of the scapegoating. And my mindset goes into, what are you trying to absolve yourself of that you actually need to project it onto somebody else? And how do we solve that? And oftentimes the answer is therapy. Most of the time the answer is therapy. Usually goes back to some kind of childhood trauma that happened. But it's interesting then in terms of what you were talking about now with this idea of a glass cliff. And I think the glass cliff imagery even works, right? Because you send this goat literally off to just like go right off the cliff, and then you never have to think about it again. And for me, right away, I think of these leaders who do set you up for success. And I say, what are they trying to distract everybody else from? Because for me, it really, when you scapegoat somebody, you are basically trying to put all of the attention on this one thing, that look at this thing that's not working, and see like, she couldn't do it, or they couldn't do it, and they couldn't take care of it. And so in the background, it then allows you to walk away kind of guilt-free or without anybody noticing what you're actually messing up on as well. And so I think scapegoating oftentimes I think it can be very manipulative. Definitely, like there's a lot of that. But I think it also comes from a side of like severe lack of faith in yourself, and then a lack of, an ability or the tools to acknowledge that or to get support there. And so it's just easier to distract everybody and say, go look at this thing that has like all of this terrible stuff happening. And then I don't have to worry about it. And I feel like if that person's messing up, then what I've done or what I'm not able to do suddenly isn't so bad.
Yeah. Oh my gosh. This is so cool having a cultural anthropologist in the conversation and just understanding the etymology of it. And it also reminds me a little bit of imposter syndrome too, right? Where with imposter syndrome, we place this label on historically excluded people, and then the emphasis becomes on fixing those people, which is really a distraction from the broken system. So instead of, fixing people, what if we fix the places that people worked at, which I think is what we're both talking about.
100%. And I kind of use that example, like just like last week at a social event. And of course, it's a social event and I have to talk about homelessness, but it comes up, right? So for me, so we're talking about this and, we have these like family friends are talking about like, we went down to the city and it was like, oh my God, there was like all these homeless people. And, you could just feel the judgment coming across, right? And it's just like, now we're looking at these people who are like, and they're saying like, well, I mean, they want to be on the streets. It's like, okay, let's get curious about that. Like,
Mm,
why is it that they'd rather be in the streets
mm,
versus in a shelter? Why is it
yeah,
that, even if they've gone to a church, the church has actually refused them? What is going on there? It's like we're like again, we're scapegoating the person that is actually the victim of the system, right? And also like, I talk about this a lot, but it's like that collective ownership over it, right? Like
mm,
everyone's like looking at everybody else to take the blame, but nobody is taking any ownership over things. Like why not also look at the fact that when we think about homelessness or we think about things, it's like, okay, actually, why are we not paying attention to inflation? Why are we not paying attention
mm,
to rising home prices? Why are we not paying attention to the fact that there are communities that, when we talk about gentrification, like, yes, there are communities that are like, yes, we want to have like a nicer, safer
mm,
community, but we don't want to be run out of it. Right. And
mm.
so now it's like, how are we not looking at those factors? But we're just looking at the outcome of it. And we're just like looking at like, of course, and it just kind of again puts that whole idea about the vulnerabilities, right? Like the vulnerable are the ones who have to then defend themselves from all of this while the people who are, benefiting from it or are just kind of laissez-faire and don't have to think about it are the ones who are contributing to some of this.
It feels like there's big power dynamics in here, right? And
Oh,
whoever has
100%.
least power is the one that is getting scapegoated.
Yes, I mean, this is why this conversation is so exciting because, like, I feel like Amna and I are going to share a brain for this entire conversation. But it's in terms of that power dynamics for me, the biggest, and again, I guess if we're looking at human beings and our evolution over time, one of the things that has been maintained throughout our evolution is this need to be part of a community because that's ultimately what separated us in the evolutionary phases and made us or allowed us to be more successful and kind of to survive in the species in the form that we are today. And so for me, when I think of those power dynamics, and I was writing a post about it recently on LinkedIn, but this idea of how the people who know how to play a game, so in the workplace, for example, right? If you know the rules of the game, you understand the nuance, you have enough context, you have that power to decide who is and isn't going to be playing the game as well. And so you can give out certain amounts of context to then help people get ahead in the game or to help slow people down in the game. And ultimately, you recognize, because we all do as human beings, even if we're not conscious of it, our unconscious mind recognizes that every single person around us is fighting for membership in the community that we're also fighting for membership in. And so our only way of ensuring our survival, or not our only way, the easiest way, the lazy way of ensuring our survival is just to ensure that nobody else survives or that, fewer people or the people who could be our competition don't survive. And I feel like it's like that classic dad joke of, if you ever get chased by a bear, you don't have to outrun the bear. You just have to outrun your friend and then you're taken care of. Right. And it's the idea of like, if you just let your friend get eaten by a bear and then the bear is satisfied, you can go off with your life. And I feel like the game of work is very, very similar where it's like, in order to maintain membership in a community, which leads to our survival, and that's what our unconscious mind, who rules all of our, or the majority of our behavior, is ruled by, we actually don't have to be the best of the best. We just have to make sure that there are some people who will always get eliminated from the community before we will. And as long as we stay a couple steps ahead of them, we're good. And that 100% is exactly this power dynamic you're talking about. Amna, is just the second you know more about how to play the game, the second you have a little bit more context about how to survive in that community, suddenly you do have a power imbalance. And, to quote Spider-Man movies, with great power comes great responsibility. And I think we don't recognize that enough.
Wow, I literally have no words. Like,
Yeah.
just all this is like this is bringing up is like I'm just thinking about even when you just said that part, right? Of like we just have to outrun our friend, or we don't really actually have to be the best of the best and all these things. I mean, got many thoughts coming through my head right now that I want to spew out at the same time. But one of them is that, again, right, humans are biologically built to survive, right? Like that's the biggest thing is like, okay, survival, like let's get through this. But then how do you actually flip that? Like, it's like, instead of it being this, like this dynamic of, like I just have to outrun this person in a world where like we're not in the caveman days anymore, right? But we like our caveman days, I guess you could say, is like the workplace. It's just like functioning in society with all the things that are happening. Like all the social injustice stuff that's going on, all the things that are going on in the world, like all of those pieces, what like it's coming up for me, it's almost kind of this idea then it's like, all right, you know what? We just got to let this minority group take it so that we can just survive. Like, I'm not going to necessarily like speak up because it's going to put me in hot water. So let them just go ahead and take the brunt of it. I don't know. What are your guys' thoughts?
This part of the conversation is like giving me such anxiety. And because like I have experienced this in the workplace, my clients have experienced this in the workplace, and it's the classic framework, right, from Timo Kuhn and Kenneth Jones about white supremacy culture at work, that toxic focus on individualism versus collectivism. But how I feel, and like I would really have to sit with this. I'm like, oh, instinctually, what would I've never heard that thing about running from the bear and like needing to outrun your friends. So
This
that's
is a terrible childhood, apparently.
so interesting. I'm like, what would I do in that scenario? But the emphasis that I have always placed is that like there is no competition when we're each in our gifts, because like all the standard measures, all of them are biased, right? IQ tests are biased. The measurement tests that we take at work are biased. So like, what does best even mean? And so for me, the invitation has always been like, how do we each own our gifts? Because then we can work really collaboratively versus in competition.
I was just, as you're talking about this, I'm not, because like I can't speak for men, for example, but what this makes me think of as well is this idea that, and kind of tying into what you had said, Pal, as well, is this the question of how do we get past the idea that we have to be the best and that we have to like it's us or nothing. And I think it starts with recognizing that there's room for all of us in that community, that we can all have membership. And in order to do that, we have to unlearn a lot of that systemic oppression that has told women that binding together is just too powerful for society, right? And so there have been so many systems that have told us that it's supposed to be women against women, and there's only room for one of you, and so you have to be really, it's a dog eat dog world and all of these kinds of things. And I think we're moving into an era, at least in a lot of the circles that I have seen, and a lot of women communities that I have been a part of, you're seeing more and more women who are exactly this. I'm now stepping into their power and saying, hang on, it's to keep us outside of our gifts and outside of our power that we've been pitted against each other. But the biggest danger that we pose to society being all together doesn't actually impact, is that it actually elevates us significantly. And so how can we start to look at one another and say, I'm going to create space for you as long as you create space for me? And there's kind of that reciprocity to say, hey, if we keep building up these reciprocal relationships with one another, and we recognize that we can take up as much space as we damn well please, then suddenly we are able to actually survive in this community without that same feeling of competition. That really it harkens back to our days of, being an earlier species.
Yes. I don't know if either of you saw this, but Reshma Saujani gave a commencement speech and she was talking about bicycle face. Did you all see this?
Yeah, I saw that.
Okay, so and Payal, like if I get any part of this wrong, please jump in. But she was talking about during women's suffrage, a lot of these women would ride their penny farthing bicycles to meet with each other. And then there was this article in the newspaper talking about women in bicycle face, and like bicycle face was like a terrible thing, but basically it was like women being elated, like riding to their meetings. And essentially they were perpetuating this fear about bicycle face so we wouldn't come together and be strong because we are stronger together. And so perpetuating this fear, and the idea of scarcity and trying to separate us because of our strength in community.
Oh, wow. It's crazy. It's crazy the length. You hear these kind of stories because this is one of so many of the stories you hear of, like even women in sports, right? Like the idea that, if a woman ran, like it would kill her. And you just sit there and you're like in what world do you all just have nothing better to do with your time than to sit around and come up with incredible rumors that you're just going to go? It's crazy to me, where I'm just like, you want to be powerful? Stop worrying about women being powerful and start spending your time actually like doing things and accomplishing things in the world instead of trying to put us down. Like if you put half the energy that you put into keeping us at bay, you wouldn't have to worry about us because we'd all be doing great things. Like it's crazy to me.
Yeah, but there's so much of that like fear that's just like running everything, right? Like everything that we're doing, even like when you think about impact work that's happening, right? There's also a lot of divisiveness there too, because it's either you're not doing enough, you're doing too much, you're doing, you're yelling too much about it, you're not actually taking action enough about it. Like there's constantly this focus on, I almost find like we're focusing on the wrong thing, right? We're focusing on fighting with each other, to your point about the best of the best of like who's doing more, who's contributing more, versus the fact that we're all just contributing, right? And it's just like, can we just do it about that. But that requires us to, again, right? We have like our fundamental primal emotions of like fear and reaction, all these things that are meant for us to like survive in. And I think the problem is that 95% of the world is just living there, right? And so leaders and politicians and even like people who are genuinely trying to do good work, right? Like I always ask this question about, what is actually motivating the intention behind your impact? Is it fear or is it empathy? Because the thing is that if you're leading with fear, right? Even though you have a good cause and you're trying to like make a difference, what you're doing then is that you're just infecting and like with more fear injecting that into, and you're fine, you're motivating your group, you're motivating people, but then it's creating that same perpetual feeling versus like, are you doing it with like, empathy and hope and like positivity and stuff, and you're embracing that. But I think it's like, until I say this from the beginning, and I will always stand by this, is that we need to teach emotional intelligence at like preschool level. Like I genuinely think that what schools used to be, where they were teaching you life skills before, the more modern day introduction, was actually right. But the thing is that we just need to modernize what we were teaching, right? Like, do people need to know how to like cook a nutritional meal? Yes. Do we need to know how to manage our finances? Absolutely. Do we need to know like, how to communicate well, how to understand like empathy, like how to understand compassion, how to share things? Like, absolutely. I think that like the way that we've gone about it in schools and universities now, it's like everything's theoretical and we're not really learning things that are like applied necessarily. But that to me is the crux of it. So like to your point of, if we want to see people be more collaborative and everything, obviously it starts there.
Beautifully said.
Definitely. There are so many, and I think that's maybe the part that feels overwhelming for a lot of people doing like impactful work or like heart work. There's so much to do. And I think even like as you were talking about the school system, my brain started to just kind of like expand it to say, okay, where do we start? Oh, well, it's not there. And and then as you go and you're just like, this is just such a big thing. And how do I even start this? And how do I even get into it? And so I think like, I mean, even in terms of the scapegoating conversation, I think that's also one of the difficult parts, is that very quickly, if you're getting into, okay, I'm going to try and have an impact, I think you very quickly get into this mindset of, well, my impact now is my identity. And so if I'm not seeing the impact that I'm trying to have, then I'm not doing a good enough job. And you fall into this spiral. And then you start looking for, and that's where it brings it, I think, back to this idea of a scapegoat. I think that's one of the ways that we scapegoat people, is we start to look for then the person. Maybe it's the community, right? Like you see this all the time with people who have a drug addiction, and it's just like, well, they don't even want to get better. And it's like, okay, so let's take it a step back. Maybe like because it's not actually about them, is it? It's about the fact that you maybe went into this with a mission to try and help people rehabilitate and reintegrate into, their community or anything like this. And then when you started to hit a blocker and you felt really lost and you didn't have the tools and resources, you ended up just pointing the finger at something else because your identity suddenly felt challenged. And so I feel like one of those steps to stop scapegoating people, because I think we all do it more than we realize, because it's human nature again, right? Like there's so much of these unconscious patterns that happen, is to just take a step back and say, how do I unlink the work that I am doing from my identity and allow those to be two separate things? And I feel like I'm not sure, like with your clients and the work that you do and everything, like this question of identity and making sense of it and work and success and whatever, like I'm sure it comes up so much. So I'm so curious your thoughts on that.
Yeah. I mean, identity is like such a big part of the conversation. So I'm writing a book on ambition right now. I'm about to submit it on Tuesday.
Yay.
And I talk about the intersection of ambition and identity, because I don't think that we can have a conversation about ambition without identity, about who gets to have it, who doesn't get to have it, and what our social location is. And so identity and the prism of identity is such an important piece of this conversation. I was also thinking about, as you said, like, we all have these unconscious patterns in my mind. I was like, who have I scapegoated recently? I was at that place.
No.
Yeah.
No.
And, even with that though, Amina, like when you're talking about that ambition and identity, again, going back to the scapegoat thing, is like the person who ends up being the victim of it, like the goat, right? Like the goat where it's like, we're going to just put everything on you and now go into the wilderness and there you go, right? I mean, there's got to be so much there as well with the person who takes it on and now flips it into my role to show the world that it's okay to like for me to exist, right? Like we've literally shunned this innocent goat that had nothing to do with any of these spiritual beliefs that this community and village decided. And they're like, we're gonna use goats for this, right? And it's
Yeah.
like, here you go. And now here's your annual thing. And also it's to your point, it's just kind of like, so what is that? Like when you're working with your clients, Amina, I'm so curious. Like, I'm sure there's that part of them where it's just like part of that purpose and meaning and where it just totally takes over their entire identity is because they have felt their voice has been taken away from them or they felt
100%.
that, right? Like that they're invisible. So like how do they kind of shed some of that responsibility off of them? Like, wait a second, I'm not your scapegoat. Bye.
Yeah. Yeah. Without like giving away too much for the book, basically I talk about how a lot of the times there's two types of ambition. I talk about painful ambition versus purposeful ambition, and painful ambition is driven by our core wounds. So if there's been rejection, abandonment, humiliation, betrayal, injustice, we're going to seek to achieve from that place of pain versus that place of wholeness, and then do whatever it takes to feel good about ourselves. But in the book, I also talk about how a lot of the mindsets really are not mindsets. They're like systemic issues, and we need to understand what's ours, and we need to understand what has been placed on us, and we need to do healing work around both things.
Damn, I can't wait to read this.
Wow, honestly, yeah, put me on the list, please. I would like a signed
Seriously.
copy.
I know. I'm like, it's going to be so phenomenal. This is something I think everyone needs to really address. Hi. So I'm pausing the episode for a quick moment and for a quick favor. If you haven't already, if you could just click subscribe, leave a review wherever you're listening to this episode, it would be really helpful. The only way we can know to make sure that we provide the right type of podcast episodes, the right type of guests, and to make sure that we're delivering the type of content that you actually want to hear, it's through your reviews and through your support. Thanks. And now back to the episode. Okay, here's another concept. You know, it kind of relates back to the best of the best and the bear situation, and I'm going to ask this less about your clients and work, but more about you guys, right? And like take it back to you that sometimes, like when we're in that, like to your point, the wounded version, right? And like we're in that and we've been scapegoated and we're the ones who are like the victims of it, but then you overcome it. And then you find that resilience and you're like, okay, and now you've moved past it. Now it's been like maybe 5 years, 10 years, like you have really moved past it to the point where you don't necessarily remember what it feels like to be the scapegoat. You don't necessarily relate to it in that same way anymore. And so now you don't realize that you may be doing it to somebody else, right? Or that like it's like there's an indifference that happens with it. It's like I'm out of that situation. I'm good. So, you know, I'm out kind of a situation. I'm just so curious, like, what are your thoughts around that? Because I think that's where that empathy piece comes in for me is, you know, how do you kind of create this balance of you've gone through an experience, you understand what it is, you don't necessarily want to keep reliving it, you don't want to keep like talking about it from that perspective, you want to be able to move forward, but yet like when you see an entire community that may be still experiencing and going for it, like how do you kind of strike this balance of not being in the thick of it all the time, but also like balancing where you're at with, you know, your own experience?
You know, as you were speaking, I was thinking, I was like, no, I actually really remember my experience of being scapegoated. So I remember being victimized, but I do not feel like I live in the identity of a victim, right? So I have been victimized, and like there were so many learnings that came from that. And then I was thinking also, but I think I need to be perpetually asking myself the question of like, where are the places where I have lack of ownership? Where are the places where maybe I am acting as the victim? Where are the places where maybe I'm making somebody else the scapegoat? Because I think we need to be perpetually asking ourselves that question now that you bring it up.
Yeah. It makes me think too, as you were asking this question, Payal, about like how other cultures handle these kinds of things. And I think one of the unfortunate or like weak sides of North American culture, I mean, subjectively weak, it's just my opinion, about North American culture is because we are very, very young as a culture and we don't have a lot of the same traditions and we don't have a lot of the same history and time to learn that a lot of other cultures have. There's a lot of other communities and even indigenous communities and First Nations communities in North America who put a lot of emphasis on that oral tradition and how we tell stories, right? And so what is that narrative? And if you look at a lot of narratives that come out of these really, really old cultures, there's a lot of horrible stuff in it, but all of it, like that narrative still leads to how out of that horrible stuff, something was created. And so there really is this emphasis on evolution, but you can't look at the evolution and you can't, recognize or celebrate that evolution without also recognizing that there was shitty stuff. And I feel like we're not trained in North America or in North American culture to create a narrative for ourselves. We're not trained to actually, I mean, unless, of course, you spend time in therapy or you have a wonderful coach like Amina, I feel like if you're doing it on your own, you don't have those tools and resources to say, how do I actually make all of these terrible things that are happening a part of my story so that, as Amina said, you don't actually forget about them and it's staying fresh of like top of mind, right? It's staying in your conscious mind. And so it helps filter the things that you're going through, and it makes you see a lot of the power that came out of these types of things, because you can say, hey, I recognize that I was the victim, that this was really horrible objectively, and I'm not excusing any of that, I'm not forgetting any of it, I'm not sweeping it under the rug, but I'm going to look and see, what did it create for me, and then how can I go and help other people create the same thing as a manager, as a colleague, as a friend, a partner, like whatever the case may be. So I think that's like one side of it. And personally, it's something that I try to do, is to just go through and say, like, what is that narrative? How do I look back and see, how I've grown? But then there's other things that I do too. Like there's this thing that I started when my grandmother passed away 5 years ago, 6 years ago now. I started writing letters to my future granddaughter, because she and I always wrote letters to each other. And what I've noticed is, as I'm writing these letters to my future granddaughter about everything that happens, and the idea behind it originally, and I realized very early on that, like, it's so classic anthropologist of me to just like leave a record of my entire life, like via letters. But the original idea was, there were so many questions I still had for my grandmother when she passed away. And so I didn't want my future granddaughter to find herself in the same situation. So how can I share as much as possible? And then as I started writing these letters, they really became what now, like in, the coaching community and stuff, you would consider to be journaling effectively. I was terrible at journaling. And then the second there was a purpose and I knew that somebody was going to read these journal entries, suddenly I'm incredibly consistent with them. But one of the things I started doing is actually putting in fail safes for myself throughout the letters, where I give my future granddaughter permission. And so I think ultimately giving myself permission, if I were to like psychoanalyze myself or like these letters, to challenge me when my mindset is not open enough. And so there's so many times in these letters where I'm talking about maybe something I'm struggling with or something that I've just worked through. And I say in these letters explicitly to whoever this girl is going to be, if you ever are having a conversation with me and you feel like I am not being open-minded enough, bring me this letter. Like, show this to me so that I can do the checks and balances and I can bring myself back into an open mindset. But I think what it allows me to do too is, every time I go back and read my letters, like over the last 6 years, I can catch myself to be like, you know what, Sam, you did have this thought, or you were trying to explore this way of thinking, and then you let it drift off because other stuff got in the way. Let's reconnect with that. Let's pull on that red thread, and how do we get back into it? So I think being very intentional and like bringing that awareness into everything that we do, to say, what are little triggers or little reminders? It could even maybe be a reminder on your phone every quarter or something, to be like, just think about everything you've gone through over the last quarter. Think about everything you've gone through over the last year. What has it taught you? And how can you be a little bit better maybe at applying that to the situations you're in? In a busy world, I think sometimes we need those active reminders, as opposed to expecting our minds to do it for us.
I just love that practice of writing these letters. It's so beautiful. Like, who's going to find them, and that experience of that invitation to bring this to me and challenge me. I think that's so beautiful.
Thank you.
It makes me again think about, such a important part about history and understanding our history. Because I really think that, like, when we look at scapegoats and we look at, when we place blame on something, or just if we look at like what's happening in the world right now, right? The rise of like fascism, the rise of nationalism, the rise of all these things, right? Like, what, 80 years ago, that was the case in our world, right? And there's this obsession with future forward thinking, future everything, right? We're like moving into like the world of tomorrow and space, Odyssey and all this kind of stuff that's going on, right? That it's like this value of history has kind of like diminished over time. And I think that, this is where then, because we never remember what the outcomes of those situations were, what happened in those types of, experiences, it leads us back to the place of like kind of recreating those patterns, right? And so, to your point of like keeping it intentional, because like, we're just operating, right? We're just kind of going through the day. We're trying to get things done, whatever it is. We're just on this like, I don't know, the Lego movies type thing, right? Like, we're just moving along. But I think about, to your point, like other cultures, right? Like in Germany, right? Germany has a very, very dark history.
Mm.
And they don't let their community, their kids forget about it, but they don't also expect them to feel guilty about it. Like they
Yeah.
just are looking at it as like, hey, this is a part of it, right? You go to Berlin, which is by far one of my favorite cities. It's like so underrated, but you go
Mm.
there and literally everything there is a constant reminder of what happened, right?
Mhm.
And there is a humility and there is a understanding of that with the German folks, but there's also this understanding that's like we have this as a reminder of not necessarily like, oh, we have this statue, we have this to be proud of it. It's really to look at it as like a reminder of what can happen if we forget, right?
Mm.
And
Mm.
that's not what we see happening in the US. Like in the US, for example, we destroy old buildings to make room for skyscrapers, right? We are constantly getting rid of. It's almost like that whole idea where a lot of cultures have like, sweep it under the rug,
Mm.
right? And then we just like kind of like, let's just keep building on top of it. So we're just building on wounds over wounds over wounds, just thinking that that is going to fix it. And this is something I think about even with AI, to be honest, is that everyone's like, oh, AI is going to be revolutionary and AI is going to do this. It's like, no, the thing is that until we actually heal the wounds that we have, it's just another platform. We're just taking the
Mm.
exact same thinking, feelings, existence, and we're just placing it into another form. Look at social
Mm.
media, right? Bullying didn't go away, bullying got worse. And
Mm.
so that idea of how is it that we can have younger nations, younger cultures start to pay attention to some of these places that have already been through the darkness of it and known how to kind of find that balance? It seems like over here, if we try to even claim some level of like, let's recognize our past, it's like, oh my God, now I need to feel guilty. I need to feel ashamed. And it's just all the anger comes out in a defensive way.
It feels very centering, right? Like what you were saying of like, instead of acknowledging where there was harm done and how we can move forward in a more productive way, we kind of bring the conversation back to the by victimizing ourselves and saying, okay, well, now I'm feeling all this shame and pain, and I actually can't think about moving forward. So we center ourselves in it versus being really constructive about how we'd move forward.
Mm.
So how do we decenter ourselves?
I mean, it's the opposite of fragility, right?
Yeah. Same.
Yeah, I feel like there's two sides of my brain. There's dystopian Sam, and then there's like, Sam who's trying to be a little bit more positive and have more faith in humanity, or not in humanity, but just in like, if we break it down again from a cultural standpoint, North America, like Canada and the US specifically, were built on profits. Like that is the holy grail of Canada and the US's culture, if you will. And so our connection to the land, right? Like when settlers got here, they weren't paying attention to how Indigenous and First Nations communities were connecting to the land. They weren't like, none of that really mattered because what they were looking for was profit above everything. And that's how we've expanded. That's how our economy has grown. Like all of these things has nothing to do with our connection to the land. So for me, like as you're talking, I'm listening to all of this and I'm like, oh my gosh, this is literally a macro version of this conversation that we have been having around scapegoating, is that the US and Canada are actually incredibly weak culturally wise because we don't have deep roots, right? Because profit doesn't require you to have deep roots. It just requires you to keep building bigger infrastructure. And the deeper the roots, the harder it is to tear up that infrastructure and build new stuff. So it's actually in our best interest to not have these deep roots. And so, because of how weak we are, early on, we recognize that the only way to actually distract from that weakness and not become a victim was to victimize other people. And so when we look at, all of the ways, the efforts that have gone into creating this world power, the fact that the US dollar is the currency that governs the entire globe, right? And all of this for me, without being like, I'm not a political science major by any stretch of the imagination, so don't hate on me in the comments. But for me, if I'm looking at it like with the little that I know about all of this, I'm looking at it and I'm saying, well, we're really just afraid of failing as a culture. And so we are going to try and make all of the other people look as weak as possible and say, look at how they failed. And the way that we're going to do that is actually by making it impossible for them to succeed. And that's through like our exploitation of different resources and, different cultures and communities and all these kinds of things. So in answer to the question of like, how do we change that? There's a part of me that says, honestly, it's entirely possible that Canadian and US cultures do need to get eaten up by other cultures. And that's the dystopian Sam. That's just kind of saying sometimes you just have to learn it the hard way. I think the other way, or like a powerful way to do this, is to start as individual thoughts. We often look, right, as like we need whole societies to change. And it's like, no, you need these types of conversations to be happening, because we're going to have this conversation, then we're all going to go back and we're going to read a little bit more about all of this. We're all curious minds. And then we're going to talk about, this whole conversation with people in our circles. And so we actually start looking outside of our own cultural purview to learn about how other people are addressing things. And so then we adapt how we're addressing things. And so slowly but surely from the inside, the culture actually starts to adapt and evolve. So I think that the biggest way that we can change without getting eaten up or kind of destroyed from a North American standpoint is individual work. And that's where like the work that Amina that you're doing and Payal, like it's not, we need to stop putting so much pressure on ourselves to change whole communities. We just need to put pressure on ourselves to change ourselves. And we don't realize the ripple effects of one conversation or one sentence that we can say to somebody. And it's not about hammering it on the head and forcing things down people's throats. It's more just about just speaking our truth as we learn things, being okay with fumbling and maybe saying something that's wrong, because as we move through that thought process out loud, we don't know what's going to be a potential grain that's getting planted for somebody else. And then they go and water it, and then it turns into all these things. So I think a lot of it is going to be, intrinsic work, or like that self-reflective work. And we don't put enough emphasis on how powerful that can be right now.
Yes. Kyle, I believe I introduced you to my friend Anurag Gupta, and he just wrote the book Breaking Bias. But basically, he talks about the 4 types of bias. And this, at its root, is a conversation of unconscious bias. And his invitation is to start the work with ourselves, because when we do that unconscious bias work, then we start exactly as you said, Sam, like we have these conversations, we invite people in. Then we show up differently in our organizations, in our other community spaces, and then there's a ripple effect versus not doing the work on the inside, trying to dismantle the bigger thing, but we haven't done that work.
It all comes down to the cellular, right? So it's like the one cell that then starts to have its effect on everything else. And I think that's where exactly like Amina, like your work, when you work with these purpose-driven individuals who are really focused on the bigger systemic, and they're like, I want to change this and I want to make an impact here and everything. How do you help them like kind of like come down to the fact that and not taking on the guilt that, because I think that's really, really prominent in a lot of people who feel very deeply connected to their work, is that they feel like I'm never doing enough and I'm not doing enough to change this entire systems. And, I always take it back to the fact that like these challenges have existed for thousands of years and they're going to continue to exist like post our existence. And so it's how do you help them with recognizing, again, to that earlier point of like, that it's okay to step away. It's you're doing your piece in this bigger work, and that piece is contributing it to the larger system change that we're trying to make.
Yeah. Sustainability is a really big part of the conversation. So I have a background in wellness and in nutrition, actually. It was my career in between marketing and becoming an executive coach. I've had many. Anyway, so the reason I bring that into the work is because in order for us to sustain our activism, we need to take care of ourselves. And sometimes that means taking breaks. And so I work with so many people that are so driven to drive change that they then burn out. And if they burn out and the work fails to exist, then we haven't made a difference. And so this work, above all, needs to be sustainable for the individual and for the collective.
Yeah. I will be honest, that was a very selfish question on my end, because that is definitely something that I do really feel, and especially when you're a multi-passionate and there's so much. And also, like my work started as like a clinical therapist, right? I did the home-based counseling, I did therapy, whatever, and like moved around from that world. But like, you look at like, okay, I want to help and support like all these social impact causes. But the thing is that they all intersect with each other so much that like you can't necessarily be like, oh, I advocate for just this one thing because this one thing actually affects everything. Again, it goes back to that systems. And then it can get really overwhelming. I think also what's happened now, and again, this is totally like I'm being selfish right here and just talking about it from the lens of that you're involved in so many things with technology, with social media and everything, that you see how everything affects each other. And yet, like, again, you feel like if I'm not using my platform to speak about every single issue that is in existence, then I'm not doing my part, right? Or it's like if someone's using their platform to talk about one specific area, but they're not necessarily mentioning the other areas, then we again like kind of like cancel culture, right? And then we go into the space of like,
Mm-hmm.
oh, you didn't talk about this using your platform. You know, you shouldn't be allowed to have a platform canceled, right? That's another
Yeah.
form of scapegoating that we've done. And
Mm.
so again, all we've done is build fear in people to speak up. And it's like, well, I don't know now. What can I say? What can I not say? What should I say? Like, does this feel right? Does this not feel right? And then you just get exhausted from that.
It's interesting. I do have to name this, Payal, because as women, and I feel like anybody who's listening to this, we just need these verbal reminders. But I heard you multiple times say that you were being selfish, and that is not what you were being. You were just asking a question. And I feel like a lot of men wouldn't even think to say that. And I think it ties into a lot of what you're saying around this whole the guilt we have, or we're not doing enough, or we could be doing more. I'm thinking too much about myself and I'm not thinking about other people. And I think that's what keeps us from doing the internal work, is that feeling of, well, I'm spending too much time thinking about me. And so I need to actually be spending time thinking about other people. And then when you look at kind of, Amna, you said, well, no, actually, the only way you can, it's like the classic, you know, before putting an oxygen mask on somebody else, you have to put it on yourself. It's so cliche, but it's there for a reason. And so I think that's the first thing that I just wanted to, as I heard this, because I was like, no, we are not being selfish. That is not a word right now.
Thank you.
But the other thing that I was thinking about as you were both talking is this idea, and it ties into the wellness you were talking about as well, Amna, as I think when we look at how a lot of other cultures deal with shame and guilt, a lot of the ones that are successful with that have built into their cultural rituals a way of actually evacuating that shame, right? So you can go like as far, the far extremes, right? Like a samurai who's going to fall on his own sword because, you know, he wasn't able to do his job as a warrior. That's extreme, and I don't recommend that people do that. But there are a lot less extreme ways to do that we see in so many different cultures, because there are these communities that realize, usually because they have some kind of energy worker or healer at the center of their community who's actually seen as really, really powerful, and not just like this granola person who's, you know, on TikTok, who's telling them that the only way that you can actually continue to exist wholly in society and in your community and be as impactful as you want to is to actually evacuate that shame. And I think in North American culture, we don't have that. And in the hustle culture and the, you know, the workplace grind and stuff, we don't have that. It's either a get over it and move on kind of mentality, or it's a just don't feel it at all kind of mentality. But I don't think that there's a lot of conversation around feel the guilt. And I make a difference between guilt and shame, because I think I've read in places that shame is more this idea, it's more like externally held, where it's the feeling of like other people are looking bad at you. And so that comes back to the, am I going to be ostracized from my community? Whereas guilt is just this nasty, it's just this gross feeling of like, I'm not proud of what I did, or I'm not proud of that situation. How can I sit in that and recognize it so that I can do differently next time? But then how do I evacuate it? And I feel like there's so many forms, whether it's like meditation, if you're into that, or going for a walk and intentionally just like visualizing it, you know, like disappearing. There's so many different things that you can be doing. But I think it's important to incorporate that into our routine, our self-care routine, is when we do have that feeling of guilt, how do we actually give it space to evacuate? Because otherwise it keeps taking up space, even though we're not aware of it. And it slowly just, you know, infests everything that we do.
That was so beautifully said. And I also feel like when we hang on to our guilt and shame, which is culturally co-signed for a lot of historically excluded people, it keeps us from the work that we really want to do. And Payal, I am not the clinical psychologist here, you are. But what I notice with a lot of my clients is that guilt is often secondary to something else. So when there's guilt there, I'm always like, well, what's really underneath it? What's behind it? Because there's the mechanism of like what's keeping us stuck.
Yeah. And I think that that's kind of, again, the misfortune of scapegoat, is that you just get wrapped up into, there's so much of the self-absorption of needing to, either people just accept that, and they just accept that like, well, this is just who I am. And if I need to survive in this world, then I need to just act based off of what is going to keep me accepted in that. And that may mean denying your own self. Right. And then it just perpetuates more shame, more of those things. And it just kind of keeps building up to a point where you just completely lose yourself. Right. There's like a loss that happens, which I do think that happens a lot with like the boomer generation. And then, you know, you look at that piece of, yeah, the guilt that you're carrying. But I think to your point also, like, I really think that to uncover guilt is to uncover all of the external beliefs that you have adopted in you and that have been given to you. And so the more you can become conscious, and this is what I always say, like, in, you know, whenever I talk about things, is like, we've got to get to a place where people can accept that this version of the world that I see, I recognize that this is the world that I see because of the influences that have made me who I am. But this isn't the only version that exists, right? And I think that there's that part that becomes really hard. And what creates more of that, blaming factor is that there's such an undeniable need to feel right, that my world is right. And if someone else talks about a world that's different than mine, then you have just completely denied my reality, right? And then by denying that reality, it's like there's this level of guilt, there's a level of shame that's coming because every influence I may have had, whether it's like the neighborhood I grew up in, the family, the way they speak about things, just whatever's coming up, it's like that has formed it. And now you're denying that that reality doesn't exist. And to your point, Sam, like when you're talking about like, the North American cultures being very new and that we've built on capitalism, right? Profit, is that what you're asking to do, or what we all three of us are asking for the world to do, is fundamentally completely against the value system of the North American cultures. So there is this actual conflict of what truly this country has been built on, what this nation has been built on, what it's seen, and it's only perpetuated more of that like instant gratification of like monetary reward and everything, that we have completely lost all touch with the world that's allowed it to occur and happen, and we're destroying that world, right? But I wonder from both of you, the perspective of like even this next generation of Gen Z, right? That's like blowing up the world right now in a different way and just kind of bringing attention back to the things that we have just completely been like, we're not going to look at, we're going to put a blind eye to it. So I guess the question I'm going to ask you both is that, do you have hope restored with Gen Z? Or do you think that to some degree, as every generation, you start off young, feeling really full of power and excited, and then as time goes on, you get just tired, exhausted, your knees hurt, and you're like, forget it, I'm good?
I've been very in this conversation of hope slash despair, just with the multiple genocides happening in the world
Right.
right now, and just like really asking people like how do we find the hope? Is there hope? Like, is it despair? Like, which one is it? And so much of the conversation has been about turning to the despair, because the despair is really important to look at, and also the sustainability and taking breaks, and then the hope. And it's like, I feel like it's that journey of like, look at the despair, understand what's there, take some breaks. Okay, we can come back to the hope. And so I do feel really hopeful with Gen Z, with millennials too. Like, shout out to like, I don't know, I feel like our generation has made some strides. So Gen Z can stand on our shoulders,
Yeah.
Spoken like a true millennial.
Yeah.
But I do.
Millennials are the most insular like group ever.
So I do feel hopeful, because if I didn't feel hopeful, I would live in the despair, and I just don't feel available for that.
Yeah. Well said.
Wow. Beautifully said. Yeah. I mean, like I said earlier, there's dystopian Sam and there's faith in humanity Sam. So I think that, I definitely have hope. I believe that things are very cyclical. And I think that with each cycle, we get a little bit better. And so I think with Gen Z, we're getting to that, right? We're seeing a lot of the same stuff that we saw in the 60s and 70s with like the hippie movement and a lot of the protests that were happening against the Vietnam War and like other things like that. So I think like we're seeing this cycle come back, only this time now the beauty is we have, that whole generation. Like I look at my uncle was like the poster child for the hippie movement in the 70s, and I see how he's raising his grandkids. And like, I'm so grateful that he's able to bestow upon them some of those tools and resources to say, you're Gen Z, you're fighting the same things that I was fighting all that time ago. They might, have different names now, but there's still similar systemic issues and those types of things. And so I think, yeah, Gen Z has a lot of tools and resources at their fingertips to be able to wear down these systems of oppression even more. So I think I do have a lot of hope there. I think it's also on us as those older, like middle generations, I would say, like the millennials and the Gen Xers. And
it's okay. We're middle aged. We can say it.
Listen, I'm in severe denial. So, but it's on us as well to, I think in an effort, or at least I won't speak for the entire generation. I will speak for myself personally with a sister who's right on the cusp of Gen Z and millennial, but spends a lot of time on the Gen Z side of her identity. I often find myself trying to almost not silencing her, but indirectly silencing her or trying to reduce her power. And then I have to catch myself because I'm trying to teach her how to communicate what she's trying to say effectively so that she can actually be heard by the very people that need to hear her message. And I think so often, we know this about the way that our minds work is that those filters that we have and those unconscious biases that we have filter so much of the input that we're getting. Like I read, like there's studies around like upwards of 70% or something ridiculous like that of the input that we get from all of our senses is filtered through our unconscious mind. And so our conscious mind is only aware of 30% of that information. So for me, if you want to change the people who currently have a lot of the power over legislation, over the decision making and everything like that, they need to hear your message. And I think we get it sometimes where like I find myself often getting into this mode of, okay, no, let's sit down. I see what you're posting on Instagram. I see how important it is. I truly believe 100% I'm behind you, but your message is not going to get through to the same people. You're preaching to the choir. And then I fall into this mode of kind of, in a way, kind of silencing her, diminishing her message. And so that for me personally has been this, and maybe that's a challenge, I think, for our generation in general, is to say, we know the effective way to communicate and we bridge that gap between other generations. But in trying to bridge the gap, how do we make sure that we're not actually changing the message or trying to reduce their power and do the same thing that we were put through as a generation? So how do we uplift them while also using the knowledge and skill sets that we have to make their message even more powerful and to kind of amplify that message in a way that's going to land in the generations that really need to be making the changes? I have hope, but like we need to be a part of them being successful because I think, it's not just on them to carry that. We have a really important role to play.
I think that kind of goes back to what Amina had said about the glass cliff, right? It's like the idea where it's like, here's a message, here's someone who has powerful things to say. Let's not just leave them hanging by themselves to do it. Let's actually give them the tools and the right space. And so I think it just comes full circle back to that moment. And this is again where I feel like we get so stuck in the nuances of, for example, how we phrase things, the words we use, right? And we get into like all these arguments about what's appropriate now, what's not appropriate, and all these things. And again, with evolution of time, a lot of our words have changed meaning, and it's really looking at that as like what used to be considered, for example, like in the 50s, like gay meant happy. It did not have anything to do with, what it means now, right? So it's just like, instead of, again, to your point, going back to like focusing on the nuances of that, it's like, how do we get that communication across? And if that may mean that we're not necessarily going to use the word that we believe in, but we can use a word that is more familiar to the group that we're just trying to help them understand. And then like, so we can bridge that gap, then so be it.
Yeah, 100%. I say this a lot too, like as I've been growing my business and everything, and that realization that I had, I think that probably came with age. I think that's sometimes in life, you just have to wait until you hit that point where you're like, okay, my humility has now been forced upon me. But it was that realization of, or like I say a lot, that I'm at this point in my career where I don't really care what cup people drink my Kool-Aid out of, as long as they're drinking my Kool-Aid. Jared in finance is my anti-hero. So whenever I talk about like that person at work, I talk about Jared in finance. I'm so sorry to all the Jareds in finance. We're actually really good people. But it's like if Jared in finance wants to drink my Kool-Aid out of a chalice and somebody else wants to drink it out of a teacup and somebody else wants to drink it out of a beer stein, like 100%, that's totally fine. I need to stop being too focused on the vessel and I need to be more focused on what is actually inside of it. And so sometimes, it means playing a little bit of that Trojan horse. And I think in order to do that, it means being really sure of our message. And sometimes I feel like we don't fully develop what our message is. And I think this goes back to what you were both talking about at the beginning of this conversation, which is this idea of what is behind the impact that you want to have? What is actually driving it? Because I think if your message is coming from this place of fear, like you were saying, Payal, you end up in this situation where then maybe your message can get easily swayed, or maybe it's changing a little bit. And then in that case, what's in that vessel, if it's constantly changing, people are going to be a little bit skeptical of it. Whereas if you're consistent about it and you're really grounded in it and you're not changing what that is, and you've really defined the words and the terms and how you're approaching everything, then I think people are a lot more willing to say, oh, okay, like, let me try this out. I'm going to try it in the cup that I'm comfortable with and I brought from my home because that's what makes me feel better and it looks cuter on my desk. But I'm comfortable with you filling my cup with something.
Oh my gosh. Could talk to you guys probably for hours and hours and hours on all of this. I think everything about this just continues to take me back to the idea of collective ownership. And I think that the more we can actually get to a place where we can collectively say, like, we all play a role in this, right? So then there isn't this idea of let's like, oh, that's the problem. Like the systems are the issue, or like this is the issue. It's like, no, actually, the issue is all of us. We all play a role. Even your indifference is playing a role,
Mm,
right? So I think even just being able to take ownership over that, like, yeah, I recognize that I'm indifferent about this, and I recognize that that may cause some discourse. I think even just owning up to that can actually kind of
mm,
diffuse some of the challenges that people feel about like what's my role in all of this, right? And I also think it's okay to kind of be able to say that, like, yeah, you know what, I don't know enough information to actually have an opinion about this. I don't know enough, and
mm,
that's my ownership, is that I don't know,
mm,
right? My ownership is my ignorance. My ownership is my naivety. My ownership is my uncomfort with knowing, right?
mm,
Like the anxiety that even comes up. And I know I have this at times where, like, there's certain issues that, like, I want to go there, but then the minute I go there, my anxiety goes through the roof. And it's really
mm,
because then I recognize, like, oh, wait a second, I may not yet have the tools that I need to
mm,
have internally for me to be ready to face that. So let me then go back to that piece, right? So it's kind of like knowing that depending on what the challenge or issues are, we may be a little bit ahead in one area, we may be a little bit behind another area, we may not have even gotten to the start line in the other area. And that's okay. You're not supposed to be like, and I think that that's where it's like removing the level of perfectionism, which again goes back to shame, which again goes back to imposter syndrome, which goes back to guilt. Like it's all connected to each
mm,
other. But it's just even taking that simple ownership of being like, hey, you know what? I actually don't know enough information, and that's on me.
mm,
I feel like we need to like let it be messy, because I feel
Yeah.
like so many
mm,
people like they'll get to that I'm taking ownership piece and I don't know enough, and then they fail to take action, and they live in the I don't know
mm,
enough space because of the perfectionism, because of the guilt, because of the shame, because we're not letting ourselves learn as we go and let ourselves get it wrong. We have to get it wrong so we could get it right.
And we have to allow people to get it wrong.
100%. Like let them do it in their way too. And this is something that I learned recently of like, I used to feel like activism needed to look a very specific way.
mm,
And especially over the last couple of years, I've really had to let that go and let people do it in their own way. It's not for me to
mm,
decide. That's so
Yeah.
righteous, which I can
Yeah.
be.
mm,
If there is something that you could leave for the listeners from the three different journey maps, right? So one are people who are just, I just don't care.
mm.
How do you kind of like approach that conversation or have them actually maybe why do you not care? Individuals who are feeling the indifference and then the individuals who are feeling very compelled to making that shift, right? How do we help each one of them kind of recognize their role that they're playing in the world of scapegoats?
I had a scenario with a very close friend in the last year where they were really indifferent about something that was very
Mm,
personal and big to me. And I kept going back to them and asking the question of, why are you indifferent? Like but through the lens of curiosity. And sometimes I got it wrong and
mm,
sometimes it was messy. But I just kept going back through the lens of curiosity. Why are you indifferent? Why are you indifferent? And I was just asking them to really sit with that question. I wasn't asking them to do anything to show up differently. Like, please just sit with that question. And it took several months, but then they came back and they were like, well, actually, under my indifference was shame, was guilt, was a lack of knowledge. And I didn't know how to do this the right
mm,
way. So I just did nothing and I hid in my indifference. And it was
mm.
so powerful. And I was so grateful that they actually sat with it and asked themselves a question. But I think even to just sit with that simple question can really be such a huge opening. So if you are indifferent, just why?
Yeah.
I think as well, like really focusing on that question too, because for me, it's sometimes I like to reframe things. And so my question almost, and you can both tell me better because you both work with humans in that way, but I almost wonder if asking a question like, what would it take to make you care? Or like what's missing that and you can learn a lot about a person by just hearing those answers. And so yeah, just being able to sometimes reframe it and bring it back to them and say, okay, like you're indifferent to this, or this is not important to you. What would make it important? What are the things that are important to you? Tell me more about those. Why are they so important? And so I think you kind of do this roundabout and it takes a lot of time. And I think it's, you have to have that trusting relationship. But I think you have to be open. Like, Amna, I love that you said it was messy and I didn't always do it perfectly. And I think, the best relationships, the ones that change the world, are going to be really messy and have those kind of conversations. But yeah, ultimately just being able to explore that person I think we're really quick to assume that we know why somebody is reacting in a certain way, often because they've done such a good job at constructing this identity or this mask that's outward facing. And there's so much under that, kind of like you said with your friend. So being able to just go back and say, okay, like, I just want to learn more about you then. Like, I've spent a lot of time telling you what's important to me. Clearly, we're not aligned here. So what's important to you? And then I think slowly you start to find these little threads that you can pull on and you can start linking them. And then you can create that full picture, or you discover more about a person and then you end up saying, oh my gosh, that's a bigger hill that we're going to climb. So like, okay, now this is important to me. Let's work on that, because you see that sometimes the indirect work is just as important as the direct work. So I feel like if somebody is not caring about something or they're indifferent, sometimes the most impactful thing isn't to get them to care about the thing that you care about, but it's to actually help them on their journey to solve whatever is really important to them, because it is still going to have an impact, right? And so that's, I guess, kind of my other approach to that, is to just, we all want somebody to listen to us and to not assume what our lived experience is or what our reality is. And so I think in these kind of situations, it's probably the hardest to listen to other people, because sometimes there are these what feel like objective realities or objective truths to say, this is objectively shitty and you need to care about it. And then recognizing that, well, even a perspective on something that feels very objective can actually, the two perspectives on that reality can exist at the same time, I think opens you up to a whole new discussion that makes people feel a lot safer. And then, you know, the byproduct of that is it reduces the scapegoats and everything, because it reduces the shame, the guilt, like all of these types of things, and it creates a safer space for them to come out.
Yeah. I think it just comes down to, again, right? Like both of you are saying, is just having just some compassion of just understanding on both sides. Like, we don't know what's the underlying for the person who's being indifferent. We don't understand what they may be battling that we just don't know about, you know, that they're going through as well. And it's just occupying them. But how, to your point, Sam, is just like, just finding out, right? Like, what is it that is going on, that how can we shift that indifference to caring, and caring in a way that feels safe to you? I think that's really important. So thank you, ladies, both of you, for coming on and for this incredible conversation. I swear to God, we could probably like talk about this forever. I'm so excited, Amina, for your book. Like, genuinely, I know it's going to be so phenomenal, and no one needs to be indifferent to reading it. They just all need to read it.
Bless you for that plug. Thank you so much. Thank you for having us. This was honestly such a beautiful conversation. You are masterful at this. This was so easeful and joyful, and just really, we got in there and it was wonderful. Thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah.
No,
Definitely a lot of things that I'm taking away. Like, I'm walking away from this being like, so many of the things that I heard, like, I've been going into like, okay, what can other people do? And I'm like, in the background, I'm going to walk away from this and now start looking inwards and kind of be like, how can I be better at those types of things too? So I feel like so often on podcasts, we hear people and they're like, wow, they figured it all out. And I'm just like, I just learned so much from all of this conversation.
Yeah.
So I'm so grateful to you both.
I think it's so important to remember that, like, all of us are human, and human means that it's going to be, in the Amina's words, messy. And, you know, it just means like, you know, I'll get told this, like, your business is RK empathy. You have empathy. Why are you not having empathy? I'm like, I've met my empathy quota for the day. Like, I'm good. You know, like, I will have those moments and it's okay. And I'm accepting it. Like, I research empathy. I talk about empathy, but, you know, we're all growing, and just we're lifing. So thank you both. This is so, so fun. I know everyone's going to get so much out of this, and I can't wait to have both of you back at some point. I really hope that you enjoy this episode, and I just have one favor to ask you. If you could just make sure to hit that subscribe button, leave a rating and review, it's going to help us tremendously to make sure that we reach as many people as possible that you think should be listening to our episodes. I'll see you next week for another episode, and thank you so much for leaving that one review, that one subscription, and sharing this with your friends.